there is a lot of other shit you could be doing tonight. It is Friday in New Orleans. What in the hell? Like, really, what in the hell are any of us doing here? Like, myself included. Like, I lived here for 10 years. I know there's better stuff to do, but I'm gonna try to get you out of here in time to still enjoy Friday night in New Orleans. So you're gonna get whatever I can offer you, and then you're gonna go out and you're gonna have fun, and you're going to enjoy the sort of closing moments of this fantastic conference, which, by the way, it is a real honor to always, the last 15 or 16 years, I guess, that I've been coming to the conference. It is always nice to be back. I really appreciate the honor of being able to be here this evening and to share some thoughts with you. And I want to be real deliberate about this particular talk.
What's in that bottle, Tim?
Oh, that's water. That's water. You know me well, but that is water. It won't be in a couple of hours, but right now it's water. So why this talk? If you saw the title in the program, you know it is entitled The Pathology of Privilege. And the reason that I wanted to speak about this evening is that, for years, those of us who do anti-racism work and work around issues of white privilege and systemic inequality have made something of a living out of, frankly, proving the existence of this thing called privilege, proving the existence of unearned advantage, whether that's white privilege, male privilege, straight privilege, class privilege, whatever the case might be. We have made a bit of a living out of proving that to people and then being very proud of ourselves for having proven what is really incredibly obvious to an awful lot of people. Right? It's like proving that rain actually falls from the sky. Yes, it does. And then we pat ourselves on the back for demonstrating all the evidence of white privilege, of male privilege, of straight privilege. Now, I don't mean to demean the importance of proving that, because obviously there are an awful lot of people in denial about that. But the problem with that as your paradigm, as your mode of operation, is that we live in a society where even if I manage to convince you of your unearned advantage, and that is a big if, because it's not a given, even if I manage to convince you of it, that certainly does not mean that you will necessarily be moved to give up those advantages. And that is an understatement of somewhat biblical proportions, but there it is in any event. In fact, we live in a society where, if anything, it is quite the opposite, right? We live in a society where if you have an advantage, you are not supposed to give that shit away. You are supposed to multiply it, right? When our parents told us, count your blessings, they did not follow that up with, and then give that shit to somebody else. Back in the day, my mom used to tell me her parents would say, hey, eat all that food on your plate. Don't you know there are children starving in China? Notice she did not say, box that shit up and send it to China. What she said was, eat, have seconds. Why don't you have thirds? Because, there are starving people, but that's none of your concern. In other words, right, we live in a society that says when you have an edge, you don't give that up, you multiply it. You take advantage of it. And so we have to figure out not just how to prove that privilege is real, but how to actually convince people that it's toxic and that it's worth giving up. And that's a hard thing to do, because why would you want to give up your edge in a society that is all about having an edge? Many years ago, I had this conversation with one of my mentors and people that I learned so much from, the late, great Derek Bell, law professor at Harvard and then NYU, who has since passed. But he said to me in our conversation that was the holy grail of anti-racism, was figuring out how you convince white people. And I could make the same argument about sex and gender and male privilege. I could make the same argument about any system of privilege. How do you convince those with an edge to actually be willing to sacrifice that edge or fight for a system in which that edge does no longer advantage them and exist? And I will tell you today that I do not claim to have discovered Derek Bell's Holy Grail, but I do have some thoughts about why even the privileged should think twice about indulging our advantages at the expense of equity and at the expense of justice. Indeed, I would suggest to you that privilege is pathological. It is ultimately destructive, even to those who benefit from it in the short and the medium term, and thus this talk. Let me be clear, though, before I get into that, what I am not saying. I am not saying that the privileged are the ones we ought to feel sorry for. So please don't get confused. I'm not saying that we should shed tears for the pain of privilege for the privileged. My goodness, these poor white people. My God. My goodness, these poor men. We must feel for them and create support groups and structures. I'm not saying that. I'm also not saying that the harm that privilege does to the privileged is morally or practically equivalent to the harm done to those who don't have it. I realize that we cannot equate those two. The harm done to those who are oppressed and marginalized is both quantitatively and qualitatively greater, no question. I'm also not saying that we should center the problems associated with privilege for the privileged in our larger work. Obviously, the experiences of the marginalized have to be central in our moral universe and in our movement building. What I am saying, however, is this. Unless we have an analysis around the dysfunctionality and even pathology of privilege, even for those who receive it, a few very serious problems emerge for any attempt to build effective movements for equity and liberation. First, if we don't have an analysis around the pathology of privilege, we miss an opportunity to create a shared sense of injury from this system of inequality, and therefore we sacrifice an opportunity to build a mentality of solidarity. How do I build a mentality of solidarity with you if I don't understand that my liberation is intimately connected to yours? I can't. Without an analysis of the pathology and the downside of privilege, we ultimately reinforce an us against them mentality, whereby any change to the system is seen as a net loss to those who have had advantages, and it's a zero-sum game. So if you win, I lose. And if I lose, you win. And I'm telling you right now, from a movement building perspective, if you think you can build movements for human liberation on the basis of a zero-sum game, you have not paid attention to history. It doesn't work that way. If we reinforce the idea that your win comes at the expense of me, my inclination will be to double down, to triple down, to quadruple down on my advantage, and to ignore your cries for justice. And that in turn means, if we do not build an analysis around why privilege is dysfunctional, and if we just don't care about the creation of this zero-sum thinking, it means that we are willing to risk everything on one of two things, neither of which are very good bets. Number one, that white allies or co-conspirators, if you prefer the terminology, can be counted on to stay in this work solely on the basis of altruistic and selfless motives. Right? That somehow we can convince white folks to stay in the work just because it's the right thing to do. I don't know about y'all, I've known white people a long-ass time. I've been white for 49 years. I know my people relatively well, and please do not get this twisted. I do not hate white people. Let me say this shit up front, because I know that every time I say this, people get it confused, and they say, particularly first-time NCORE folks who were like, what the hell is this? I didn't come here for this. I'm the student body vice president. What the hell did they get me into? I don't hate white people. I love me some white people. My wife is white. I love her. Our daughters are white. That's what happens when white people make babies. I love them. My mom is white. Nice white lady. My dad and I don't get along, but it's not about the white shit. It's about some other stuff that I do not have time to process here tonight. But If you have a psychology degree or degree in therapy or analysis, you please can feel free to come help me with that later. I don't have time tonight. It's not about white people, it's about whiteness. What I'm saying is white people and whiteness are not the same, right? And if we don't understand that, if we don't understand that people called white can be damaged by this thing called whiteness, not as seriously as people of color are, and not as directly, but we can be the collateral damage of our own bullshit. If we don't understand that, then we are willing to risk everything on the idea that white folks will stay in the fight just because it's the right thing to do. But I don't trust altruism in a society rooted in self-interest. I don't trust it. I don't trust it. Or we're willing to risk the history of our country and society on the probability that somehow people of color can just overthrow this system on their own without collaboration. Maybe that's possible. I don't know. I don't see a lot of evidence of it in history, but even if it is possible, here's the point. Even if black and brown folks can liberate themselves without any white co-collaboration, who's going to liberate white folks if not us? Because even if people of color can liberate themselves, unless we link our fate to the fate of black and brown peoples and black and brown communities, we will never be free. And I learned this in this town. I lived here for 10 years. I got my start in this work doing work against David Duke in 1990 and 91 when he ran for U.S. Senate and governor of this state. Oh, no, I don't need applause for that. That's what white folks should have been doing. I don't need applause for that. But here's the problem, right? We had 6 out of 10 white people in this state that voted for a man they knew was a Nazi. And that is not a word I use lightly. I know we throw that word around sometimes for people that we just don't like. But like David Duke is an actual Nazi. Not even a neo-Nazi, because neo implies that you thought of some new shit. And David Duke is like Jurassic Nazi. Like Paleolithic Nazi, like old school Nazi, unreconstructed Nazi. And 6 out of 10 white people in this state said, well, I think I'll vote for him anyway. It's not like they didn't know. Babies in utero knew that this man was a Nazi. And 6 out of 10 white folks said that's all right with us. And I remember sitting here in this town in the aftermath of those elections trying to figure out what does that mean for my people, those who mark that census box the same way I do. Because what does it mean that 6 out of 10 of my people voted for not? Now, here's the deal. I am Jewish, so, I did know, like, don't vote for the Nazi, because, like, it's not a good look for Jews when we vote for Nazis. But, like, the white thing is still operative, right? And 6 out of 10 white folks voted for the guy. And I remember sitting there thinking, what does that mean? Because the only reason he didn't win, let's be clear, if it's up to us, he does win. The only reason he doesn't win is because black folks saved our ass. And we never did say thank you. We never did say thank you. And I haven't been deputized to say thank you tonight, but thank you to the black folks of Louisiana for saving this state from David Duke. My point is that it's not black folks' job to save white people from ourselves. You see, they did it. That was a nice favor they did. That was a nice gift that they gave us. It was a gift that was totally undeserved. But they did it anyway. At some point, we have to save ourselves. So that means we have to talk about what privilege has done to us. See, privilege and racism has allowed us to actually vote for someone like David Duke, who has no solutions for the problems that millions of white folks face economically. All he has is blame to offer and fingers to point at black and brown folks that didn't create the crisis, that didn't destroy Wall Street. That was rich white men. But all David Duke and folks like him can offer, all Richard Spencer can offer, right? All Donald Trump can offer is to point fingers at black and brown folks, those down the ladder from those white folks who voted for David Duke, and say, there is your enemy. That's the crisis of whiteness. When you take your eye off the ball and you ignore the actual source of your pain is real, your diagnosis is bullshit. And it's time that we call that out. So what does privilege do to those who have it? Well, on the one hand, we know the easy answer, right? It creates huge advantages. It creates huge material opportunities. So white folks are half as likely as black and brown folks to be unemployed. 1/3 as likely to be poor, even when they have the same level of education, by the way. White families, 15 times the net worth on average of black families, 12 times that of Latinx families. So we know all of that, the material piece. And obviously it protects recipients of privilege from, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, from systemic mistreatment. It certainly protects those who have privilege from mistreatment on the basis of the identity where they are privileged, where they are dominant, and those are obviously benefits. But the question is, what are the costs that we pay to actually access those benefits? See, here's the thing. When you are used to experiencing life in a certain way, you come to expect that reality to continue in perpetuity. So just as the oppressed and the marginalized come to expect oppression and marginalization, those who are privileged come to expect the permanence and the predictability of that as well. We assume that we will always have access to good jobs. We will always have access to the ability to support our families. We will always have access to affordable housing, education, health care. We take for granted our place, our belonging in prestigious educational institutions. We assume that as long as we play by the rules and we work hard, the promise of American meritocracy and rugged individualism, that we will always be able to succeed and move up the ladder of life and enjoy upward mobility. We come to believe in the notion of rugged individualism and meritocracy because for the most part that has tended to work for us. Now I realize that within a system of capitalism it doesn't work equally for all, but for the most part historically white folks have been able to enjoy a pretty decent measure of upward mobility intergenerationally. People of color could never take that for granted, but white folks could. Even white working class folks to some extent could. Maybe not vertical mobility, but at least horizontal mobility. What does that mean? And why does that matter? Well, think about it. That means that I could say to myself, hey, my granddaddy worked in the coal mine, my daddy worked in the coal mine, I'm gonna work in the coal mine, my son is gonna work in the coal mine. My granddaddy worked on the assembly line, my daddy worked on the assembly line, I work on the assembly line, got a good union job, gonna pass that down to my child. The notion of horizontal mobility, the idea that as long as I've got a strong back and can lift stuff, I'll always have a job. Now, I beg to remind you that black folks never took for granted that was true. No person of color ever assumed that just because they were willing to work, there'd be a job ready for them. That just because they're willing to work hard and sweat all day, that folks would hire them. But for white folks, that was sort of the truth, particularly white men, even working class white men. You come to believe in the notion of rugged individualism, of meritocracy, the idea that wherever you end up is all about you, that you're always in control of your destiny, more or less. You presume that your experiences, your cultural norms, will always be dominant and normative and unquestioned because they always have been. In other words, you come to expect certain things to stay the same because this is how they've always been. But what if your world starts to change? What if the economy globalizes in a way that makes certain of those jobs that you took for granted superfluous in the global economy? So now coal mining is no longer really a thing that's profitable because there are more affordable ways to produce energy or even to mine coal. They can just blow the tops off mountains now and don't need to hire your happy ass to go into the cave and dig it out. And all those folks who own the mines who are just about making money don't give a shit about you and your family, don't give a shit about the black lung that you might get by the time you're 53 and die by the time you're 60. All they care about is their profit. They'll just blow the top off the mountain, Jack. It's not hippies and environmentalists taking your job. It's rich white men that own the mine. But if you're not ready for that change, if you're not ready for the globalization of the economy, if you're not ready for the cultural shifts that have taken place, whereby the country has become more pluralistic, and where you now have to share the designation of what it means to be an American. See, you never had to do that, right? An American was you, right? You were the definition. You were the textbook example. You were the dictionary. You were the catalog definition, the store window model of what an American was. Man, I remember a time, I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old. I remember a time when the grocery stores, like back in the 80s, man, even like the ethnic food aisle, unless you were on the coast, if you were anywhere other than the coast, the ethnic food aisle was like pasta, yo. Like that was literally it. Like it was like just some pasta, like ragu and shit, right? And now, all of a sudden, the notion of Americanism is incredibly more pluralistic. The notion of our popular culture's totally changed, right? Those of us a little bit older than some in the room can remember a time when MTV, well, first off, we can remember a time when MTV played music videos. That was what they were. Like, I don't know if y'all, MTV stands for music television. Like, they used to show videos and shit, right? And now they don't do that, but they did. And they didn't show black videos, though. Like, Michael Jackson was the first. They showed, like, one Prince video, but they edited it or something. Like, they were nervous about it, right? And that was after many years of the existence of MTV. So now, you think about that was just the 80s, right? When they would not play black music on MTV. And now, popular culture, thoroughly multicultural. So much so that the soundtrack of pretty much any teenager's life in this country, no matter where they live, they could live in Nebraska, they could live on the East Coast, the West Coast, anywhere they live, they're gonna have a playlist of their life that is completely, in most cases, multicultural. That is not enough to change the power structure of this country, so don't misunderstand what I'm saying, but it does signify a significant cultural transformation that is not meaningless. And in particular, what it means is that those people who got used to the old cultural norms, those people who needed those norms, needed their culture to be reflected, their culture to be dominant, don't know what to do with that shift. It makes us nervous. So you have a global economy, you have cultural shifts, you have the demographic change. We've all heard about, right, that by 2042 or whatever the year is, right, half or more of the population will be people of color, half will be white. So if all of a sudden whiteness is no longer demographically normative, culturally normative, you get a black president with an exotic name who's from Hawaii or Kenya, because that's what so many folks think. But to them, it's like they might as well be the same. I think a lot of white folks think Hawaii is just like a tourist destination. They still don't realize it's part of the United States, right? It's just like, ooh, that's exotic. I don't know. I don't think he's American. Right. So you have an individual in the highest office challenging your notion of what leadership is supposed to be. You have the demographic shift challenging your notion of what the country itself is. You have the cultural changes that are challenging your notion of what the culture of America is. And all of that's happening at the same time. So imagine that you've been able to assume a steady state your whole life. You've been able to assume that I'm an American by God. I'm what a normal American looks like. And now you can't take that for granted. That privilege that you've had starts to freak you out a little bit when it doesn't get delivered. Suddenly your expectations are being disrupted. And here's the thing, if you go back to the 60s, there was a theory that developed right around the time. Y'all remember that, and if you don't remember it personally, I'm sure you've studied it. Like, you think about the urban rebellions and uprisings of the 60s. Ask yourself now, when did those happen? Most of those happened 65 and later, right? 65, 67, 68, after the assassination of Dr. King. You didn't have those happening in the same way in, let's say, 55, 57, 58. Now, why is that? Because if you think about it, right, you might think it would be more logical to have these uprisings, or what some people call riots, in the mid-50s, because at least by the mid-60s, what had happened? We'd had the Civil Rights Act, we're getting the Voting Rights Act, right? You get the Great Society programs. There are some reforms that are happening. Granted, they're not happening fast enough, right? But there's been some progress. There have been some victories. So you would think it was odd, right, that even as things are quote-unquote getting better, that's when you have the rebellion as opposed to when they were worse. Well, there was a theory to explain that. And the theory that sociologists came up with to explain it was this notion of rising expectations, right? This idea that when you take people who have been crapped on forever and you start to increase their expectations of real change, when the actual delivery of change is slower than the expectation, it creates real anxiety and anger, right? And then there's an explosion because folks are like, you promised change and you're delivering really slowly, and now I'm pissed, and you get frustrated, right? So that made sense, and for the most part, that theory has been pretty much mainstream now. It's pretty much accepted that when you raise the expectations of marginalized people, but you don't deliver, there can be an explosion. Well, let me ask you a question. If that's true, and the evidence says that it is, ask yourself what will happen when you take people who have always had high expectations, who were raised and nurtured on high expectations, and then you don't deliver to them what you promised them. Now what happens? You think there's a problem when you promise some stuff to people you never promised stuff to before, and then they get pissed? Tell me about the folks that have been promised for 300 or 400 years that life would be okay. What happens when it's not? And I'm telling you, if you think the one is an explosion, wait till you see what this produces. You understand? When you frustrate the expectations of those who have always had high expectations and a mentality of entitlement that came from that. Not only did I expect A, B, and Z, but I am entitled to A, B, and C. I'm entitled to have these benefits. I'm entitled to these advantages. That's when you have this problem. So a couple years ago, right, there's this study. And I'm sure y'all saw it. Came out, 2 economists at Princeton, husband and wife team, very well-respected academics, did this study where they were looking at mortality data from 1999 to about 2013, I think. So 14 years worth of data. And they were looking at some really interesting information that nobody seemed to be commenting on. They noticed that from 99 to 2013, for the most part, most groups in this country continued to experience a downward trajectory of mortality, death rates, right? Which is the normal trend. When you live in an advanced industrial economy, the typical trend is that people's mortality rates decline, life expectancy improves, unless you have a major epidemic or a natural disaster or something like that. That's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to live longer, die less, etc. And for most groups, that's what happened. But there was one demographic cohort for which that was not true. And it was white, middle-aged, non-college educated working class folks. And for that group, there was an excess mortality number of 500,000 people. Let me explain what this means. It means that from 1999 to 2013, 500,000 white folks died who would not have died if their mortality numbers had simply continued in the same direction as everybody else's. And I should point out to you, these deaths were not from just like simple heart disease or anything like that. It was from 3 things in particular: opioid overdoses, suicides, and cirrhosis of the liver, which is typically brought on by heavy drinking. Right? In other words, they were what these 2 researchers at Princeton called deaths of despair. Right? 500,000 excess white deaths, but not just any white folks who were working class, non-college educated, middle-aged white folks. And I remember when I saw the study, I wasn't satisfied with this analysis, because when you talk about deaths of despair, like, what's the despair? Okay, I get it. Some of these folks are unemployed. They're not able to hold down a job. The jobs are leaving their town. I get that. That's got to be anxiety producing. But here's the deal, y'all. Manufacturing jobs have been leaving the inner cities of this country and urban communities lived in by black and brown folks since 1973. So that shit is not new. Right? And the idea that deaths of despair, that it's somehow a unique thing for white folks to experience that, when black and brown folks have been dealing with that for literally 40 plus years, doesn't make any sense. To say that they're dying deaths of despair and they're drinking themselves to death and using opioids and putting guns in their mouths and killing themselves just because they can't make ends meet. If that was enough, then black folks would also be seeing that trajectory, and brown folks would also be seeing that trajectory, because on every single indicator of well-being, people of color are suffering more. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean white folks aren't suffering. I'm not trying to say that just because black and brown folks are hurting more, white pain doesn't matter. What I'm saying is there has to be a reason that white pain is dealt with differently by white people than black and brown pain. There has to be a reason that black and brown folks who are dealing with actually more economic anxiety, that famous thing that some folks want to attribute Donald Trump's victory to, because they just can't admit that it's racism. They want to say it's economic anxiety. If it was economic anxiety, black and brown folks would have lined up around the damn block to vote for this man. And I beg to remind you that they did not. So what is it about white anxiety that creates this dysfunction? The only possible answer is that these are folks who were promised the moon, promised that the world was their oyster, promised that this level of insecurity would never be their lot in life. That level of anxiety, that was for those folks on that side of town. That's not for us. We're always going to have work. We're always going to be able to make ends meet, you see? So those deaths of despair, not about despair, it's about the disconnect between aspiration and achievement, between expectation and achievement, between entitlement and achievement, right? Between the expectationalism, if you will, that whiteness has created. There are some similarities between the opioid crisis, right, which is so disproportionately affecting, not exclusively, I want to be clear, because there are black and brown folks suffering with this thing, but disproportionately white. There's a link between that and the spike in suicides in white communities. There's a link between those things and the uptick in misogyny that we see online and in the streets of our country as well. When we see somebody, not even in just our own country, but in Toronto, that guy that ran over a bunch of women and then find out that he'd been posting on these boards. He's what he called involuntary celibate, right? This community, they call themselves incels because, you know, they're mad that women won't have sex with them. And they think that they're entitled to women's bodies. That's their entire mentality. So it's not just whiteness, it's patriarchy and toxic masculinity telling men that we're entitled to the bodies of women and the attentions of women. And when they don't give us that attention and when they don't give us their bodies, then we can run them over in a car as part of an incel rebellion. This stuff is all over the internet. Why? Because toxic masculinity and patriarchy have told men that we're entitled to that we should expect it. That's what privilege does. It sets you up to expect this, and then God forbid you only got this, right? There's a link between that and the meltdown of the religious right? When they argue about, oh my God, our religious freedom is being taken away because of same-sex marriage and LGBTQ liberation struggles, as if somehow their own marriage is threatened, and they say this by same-sex marriage. If your heterosexual marriage is so weak that it can be threatened by same-sex marriage, you need marriage counseling. I'm trying to ascertain what that anxiety feels like. Like suddenly you were married to someone of the opposite sex. Now the Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage, and you're like, oh, damn. I could have held out. Like, what exactly is the problem? There's a link, though, right? Because if you've been led to believe that your sexuality is normative and that your sexuality must be ratified and reified by all, any challenge to your hegemony, not to your rights, because you still got your rights, nothing's changed, but you've been hegemonic, right? You've been able to assume your complete dominance, your unquestioned hegemony. And then if that hegemony is questioned, it's like the end of the world. I'm not sure who came up with the phrase first, but y'all have heard it, right? That when you're used to privilege, equality, or even pluralism feels like oppression, right? If I'm used to 90%, don't tell me I'm only going to get 75, because that's like the end of the world. Even if I'm in a group that's only 62% of the damn population, 75% is still not enough, y'all. You understand? Because expectationalism says it's not. There's a link between that and this guy that writes to me 2 years ago to tell me that white dude says he can't find a job because all the jobs are being taken by black folks and Mexicans. And he was sincere. Well, I know he was sincere because that shit was all in capital letters. And that is the mark of veracity, is when you put your shit in capital letters and red font. I know you're honest. He says to me, I can't get a job. All the jobs are going to black folks in Mecca. I'm like, all the jobs? all the jobs. Funny, because black folk and Latinx folks have 2 to 3 times the unemployment rate, 3 times the poverty rate of white folks, but I guess they've still taken all the jobs. I don't know where they took these jobs. They took them like a block and a half, and then were like, nah, to hell with it, I'm done. I don't know if these jobs are in Second Life, on Minecraft, or some video game. I have this image of a white farmer somewhere in Iowa, waking up at 4 in the morning, going out to the barn to milk the cow. He's got his buckets, because I guess that's still how they milk cows, I don't know. He's walking out 4 in the morning. He gets out to the barn. A black dude jumps out from behind a bale of hay and says, ha ha ha, I already milked your cow, white man. I took your job. That's right, me, Andre from Detroit. I took your job. And look, don't get me wrong, I would be sympathetic to this ridiculousness if, like, look, if like Monday, the boss called the guy up who was white and applied for the job and was like, you got the job, and white dude's all happy. And then Wednesday, the boss called and was like, I'm just kidding, I'm hiring Jose. Okay, I get it, like, that would be wrong. But that is not what is happening, yet this kid was convinced, right? Because again, his notion of expectation and entitlement told him that if a person of color got a job that he didn't get, it must have been that they jumped him in line, that he was more qualified, right? He can't even fathom the idea that maybe they were better for the job. Because entitlement and expectation says that we should all be employed before any person of color is, right? There's a link between that and the fragility, to conjure up the work of Robin DiAngelo, good friend and colleague of mine, the fragility of whiteness, right, that I notice in the hate mail that I get. Let me just give you some samplings, because if I got to deal with it, y'all can at least hear it. But now here's the good thing. Let me just some advice for y'all, because I know some of y'all do this work and you get hate mail too, and you might get it within your like campus community, or you may get it from other, I don't know. Here is a little strategy that I employ to make it not so frightening, because this is some exhausting shit. Like when you get death threats and stuff, it's not fun, but one way that you can make it less problematic is, I promise you this works, it is just a coping technique, and we all need coping techniques to let us laugh through the pain. Like, take your hate mail, because this is what I do. I take my hate mail and I bring it with me on the road, and I sit in my hotel room and I read it out loud in the voice of Goofy. Because I'm telling you, somebody threatening your life is never as scary when it starts with, well, gosh. We're gonna put you in an oven, Jew. See, that shit is not really that disturbing when it's in the voice of, I mean, it's weird, like Nazi Goofy is, weird, but he's not particularly scary. So here's the deal. But I want you to listen to the words just so you understand the pathology of privilege. What these white folks are manifesting says something. I'm not just reading you this for the laughs and like the ridiculousness of it. This actually tells you something about the mentality that whiteness has created in otherwise, I'm assuming, decent human beings. Maybe, I don't know. Here it is. First one. Someone is going to take you out, you scumbag. If you don't like white people, then fuck off to Africa. You're a piece of subhuman shit. You will not win to genocide the white race. What do you hear there other than the profanity? You hear this fear of like genociding white people, right? Because we're not the majority anymore. We don't have total hegemonic control, and therefore it's genocide. First off, that's not the definition of genocide, y'all. Like, Google that shit. Like, that's a term you can look up. Right? Like, if not having total control meant genocide, then black and brown folks got the first claim on that. Native peoples, indigenous peoples got the first claim on that. People of color have the first claim on that. Not white folks, but this guy's so upset about the loss of hegemony that he thinks that's what I'm about, just because I fight white racism. Next one. You are full of shit, clearly. You're trying to act like the good white guy to get attention and profit. I don't care what you claim. Clearly, evidence shows that racism is at a halt. Black people were being lynched. Now they run congressional positions. Please stop your bullshit. Racism is over. Wait for it. Wait for it. White power. Okay. I mean, I could not script this. Like, you just got to pick one, man. Either tell me racism is over or do the white power thing. But wait. Oh, and his name, by the way, because, you know, you can, when you send an email, you can, like, especially on my website, you used to be able to go in and, like, just put whatever fake name you wanted so I wouldn't know who you were. His name that he said, it was Greg Hitler. So, you know. Next, Tim, when the race war breaks out, you will be thrown in an oven and have your skin blister and peel while you cry in agony for mercy, you ravenous kike. But there will be no mercy for you if you don't believe in hell today. Think again. Through the power of Christ, you Jew rodents will be purged from the earth through fire and venom, ovens and gas chambers. There is a heaven. It is a place where beautiful blonde white women and girls and beautiful shit. See, there's a heaven. I got it. Where beautiful blonde white women and children can live happily in a harmonious and relatively crime-free community. Relatively, because relatively, you know, there's still gonna be a little crime, like on Heaven Wall Street, there's still gonna be a little crime. But it's relatively crime-free. Hell is also a real place, he said, and it is full of violent N-words. He did not say N-words, you know what he said, and hook-nosed kikes pushing filth and degradation among God's beautiful children. This being the case, through the power of God, hell needs to be brought to your life a little sooner, and what better way to do that than toss you and all of your ilk into an oven where you will toss and turn in agony while you spend your last waking moment repenting. You're a piece of shit. There is a bullet waiting to blow your spinal cord. Now, I know, that sucks, right? Damn, you know? That was all in like 1 week. But here's the thing, right? But what does it say? This is not about like sympathy for me and people who get death threats. This is about just asking, what does it say that took time to write? Like, it took time to come up with that. Like, hold on, let me think about this. Oh, you filthy kike. Oh, heaven is for blonde girls. Oh, there's no crime. Well, there's a little crime, but there's not much. Like, that took minutes and minutes and minutes of somebody's life that he was not producing, which is what I thought master race people did. And what it speaks to is a conditioning, right? That's a sickness. And that's not just a sickness that gets played out on people of color, or in my case, as a Jewish white person, on Jewish folks in the form of anti-Semitism. That's a sickness that is internal. Do you think that person or those people that wrote those things are healthy mentally, emotionally? How do you think they treat their own children? How do you think they treat their partners or spouses and loved ones and family, their colleagues? How in the world can we expect anyone so eaten up with resentment and anxiety and hostility that they would take the time? Because lots of people piss me off, y'all. I've never actually been like, hold up, like I can't even do dinner right now, family. I got to sit down and write some crazy, angry shit to somebody that pissed me off. Like, I just can't even fathom doing that. Like, people have lives to lead, but these people were like so bought into this sense of threat, right? Which is part of the entitlement and the expectation. Their lives are clearly not working out, and they need somebody to blame. How do you cope when everything falls apart, especially when you were told it never would? The only choice is you try and numb the pain. So you can try opioids as a way to numb the pain. That's what opiates do, right? What is an opiate? An opiate is a drug that essentially blocks pain receptors. It doesn't solve your problem, right? So like, if you have a crushed disc in your back, you might get opioids prescribed to deal with the pain, but it's not gonna fix your back, right? You're gonna have to have surgery for that. If you have cancer, they might prescribe opiates to deal with the pain, but that's not gonna solve your cancer. You're gonna have to have other treatments to deal with that. but it does block the pain receptors and give you the illusion, at least, of some comfort and some progress. So you can do that if you're white and frustrated by your position relative to your expectations. Or you can turn to a political opiate that does the same thing. Because if you want to understand the opioid crisis and Donald Trump, these things are not unrelated. And I'm not saying that because I'm saying that you had to be high to vote for Donald Trump. That's not actually my argument, though it is a fascinating sociological inquiry that if y'all are academics in that field, y'all might want to check into that. But what I can tell you is that there was, in fact, a direct proven correlation between votes for Donald Trump at the county-by-county level and the degree of opioid addiction in those same counties. The counties that were most ravaged by the opioid crisis had a disproportionate likelihood of supporting Donald Trump relative to other counties in this country. It's not because they were necessarily high at the time, but it's because Donald Trump is a walking, talking, breathing human opioid who looks at white folks and says, I can take away your pain. But just like an opioid, it doesn't stop the pain. When you say build the wall and that'll solve the problem, really? Have y'all studied capitalism? Is that how you think that shit works? You just build a wall at the border and then all of a sudden all the bosses are like, oh shit, I guess we got to give everybody a big raise now. That's not how capitalism works. Man, goods are always going to cross borders. Capital is always going to be mobile. If you allow capital to move and goods to move, but you don't let labor move, then by definition, you just rig the game against working people. And not just Mexican folk and Salvadoran folk and Honduran folk, but even working class people north of that border who'd be better off with a larger, more militant working class fighting for better wages and working conditions for all working people in the hemisphere. That's what you end up doing. But Donald Trump can hang out this banner that says, I'm on your side, right? And I'm going to bring back coal, beautiful, clean coal. We're going to get you guys back in the mines, right? Rather than transition to an economy that's not only ecologically sustainable, but sustainable for the health of those miners. He doesn't give a damn about them. He'll send them back down in the mines and they'll die at 57 years of age. He doesn't care about them. The only people that actually do care about them are the folks that are trying to get them different kinds of jobs, different kinds of opportunities to save their lives in the name of an economy that isn't rooted in profit and that isn't rooted in white domination and patriarchy. Donald Trump is a walking opiate. So we have to have sympathy for the people that get sucked into that, but we must insist that that sympathy not come at the expense of demanding a proper diagnosis. It's one thing to have economic anxiety, but we cannot allow that analysis to be separated from white expectations. The idea that Trump's supporters were simply anxious economically and that that's not connected to their racial identity is folly. Those two things are linked. I believe in sympathy for those folks, but I insist on a proper diagnosis, and I say this as a known hypochondriac. Let me clear this up. I'm a horrible hypochondriac, y'all. Bad. Like I could be dying right now. Like I just had a twinge in my back and I'm just, shit could get real any minute. Okay? I'm a hypochondriac, but here's the deal. Just to put this in perspective and relate it back to the Trump phenomena. A couple years back around New Year's, about the last 3 days of the year before New Year's, I was having these weird chest pains and because I'm a hypochondriac, I was convinced I was gonna have a heart attack. But because I am a professional hypochondriac, not an amateur like some of y'all, a professional hypochondriac, I did not go to the doctor. See, an amateur hypochondriac will go to the doctor for every little thing. A professional won't even bother because we're just like, there's no point. Nah, it's too late. Like, there's not even any point. I'm gonna die, and I just need to write my goodbyes and shit. Like, for real, that's what a professional hypochondriac does. So I sat there for 3 days in the bed. And then I did the worst thing you can do. I consulted Dr. Google. Never a good move. Dr. Google does not know what the hell he is talking about. Because you'll get on Google, look up different symptoms, and you'll get on some chat board where somebody's like, yeah, I had those symptoms, and I died 7 years ago. And for a minute, you'll be like, now, wait a minute, you didn't die. You posted that shit at 3 a.m. yesterday. But then as a hypochondriac, there's part of you that's like, shit, what if they really died? Because you're not thinking rationally. That's the whole point of hypochondria. So you're like, oh my God, I'm actually dying. So finally, 3.5, 4 days into this thing, it's my wife's birthday, because that's classy. I waited till her birthday to bring it up. We go to eat breakfast, and I'm sitting there, I'm real quiet the whole time. She's like, what's wrong? I'm like, I'm not doing so good. She's like, what's wrong? I'm like, I think I might be having some heart problems. I lowered my voice like 3 octaves like that. I'm like, well, I don't know. And she's like, well, how long has it been going on? I'm like, about 3 days, She's like, well, why don't you just go to the doctor today and see what's going on? I'm like, yeah, I think we're way past doctor stage. I think we're past that. Happy birthday. And I'm like, I think I need to go to the hospital. And she's like, oh God, really? Because she knows who she's married to, right? She's like, Tim, just go to the doctor. I'm like, no, I think I really need to go to the ER. She's like, oh God almighty, okay. But here's the thing, she was sympathetic about the pain. She did not say to me, because she's a loving, wonderful person, you're full of shit, it's all in your head. Like, she didn't say that. She didn't deny my pain was real. That would have been a mean thing to do and an awful thing. She knew if I was saying I was in pain, I really was. But she just didn't want to indulge my bullshit self-diagnosis, right? So then I go to the doctor, and they run all these tests, and $6,000 into my deductible, but still not having met it, because America, I found out I pulled a muscle. It's a $6,000 muscle. And I pulled the hell out of it. And I came back, and she's like, next time, call the doctor, right? And the same is true with this Trump thing and with understanding the larger phenomena I'm speaking of. It's fine to actually sympathize with the pain. I know there are millions of white folks in pain. That's what the economic system under which we live does to people. It's what patriarchy does to women and to men by forcing us to stifle our emotions and our ability to express tenderness and love and compassion, because that's not manly enough in a heteronormative way. Privilege soaks all of that, strains all of that, wrenches all of that empathy out of us. So I know people are in pain. I just insist that we have to demand an accurate diagnosis of the pain, because people's lives are at stake. And that's the great irony about this. When you do anti-racism work, there will always be those white folks who will insist. And I've gotten those emails too, and they're not necessarily as brutal as the ones I read you, but they're every bit as common, if not more, that talk about how I'm anti-white and how those of us who do this work hate white people and want to see white people genocided from the face of the earth. But in fact, what we are saying is that the liberation of black and brown peoples from white supremacy is central to the liberation of white peoples from whiteness and white supremacy as well. Only when we eradicate the expectationalism and entitlement mentality that comes with white supremacy will we be liberated from fear of the other, from the fragility that comes with being the dominant group and not knowing how to cope with setback. Only then will we be liberated from the naivete about how our society works. It's very dangerous when you believe, for instance, that the world is about rugged individualism and meritocracy, and then you find yourself struggling, because if you've been told your whole life that where you end up is all about you, and then you find yourself struggling when you didn't expect that, what do you do with that pain? What do you do with the disconnect? You got to either blame somebody else for your problem, but even when you do that, see, there's that voice in the back of your head, isn't there? And that voice is saying, nah, it's you. You just didn't work hard enough. You need to double down on the work effort. You're not just trying hard enough. And so even those white folks who live by rugged individualism and meritocracy end up dying by it. Because when things don't turn out for us, we don't have a place to put the pain and the disconnect, because we're so naive about how the society works. Unless people of color are liberated from white supremacy, white folks can't be, and we will continue to suffer the death of human empathy. See, empathy is a natural response to pain. It's what children do when they see another child in pain. It's a natural empathic response. It doesn't have to be taught. It's a human instinct. But white supremacy requires that we sacrifice and suppress that. Because if we didn't sacrifice it and suppress it, we couldn't live with ourselves. What happens, I ask you, to a people who generation in and generation out, in order to survive and thrive in the society built for their benefit, have to suppress one of the most basic human emotions? Do you think that that suppression of empathy and compassion only affects the other, or do you think it gets turned back upon oneself and one's family? When you have a system of privilege that forces you to stuff your emotions, it's not only at the expense of the other, it's at the expense of yourself. This isn't just whiteness, it's toxic masculinity and patriarchy, even at the most basic levels. I think about the way that many years ago, my best friend, who I've known since we were 5, now teaches at Cal State Los Angeles in the School of Education. He's been out there since '99. And probably in the mid-2000s, maybe 05, 06, 07, I went out there. He picked me up at LAX. And I was throwing my luggage in the trunk, and we were hugging to say hello. Hadn't seen him in about 5 months. And we hugged. Now, let me ask you a question. How do you think we hugged? You know how we hugged. We did that thing that guys do. It's that, how the hell are you? Just beating the hell out of your back. Like my goal in life is to bruise your spine. Because under heteronormativity, that is what real men do. Now, this is my best friend. This was the best man in my wedding, and I stood in his wedding. He's the godparent to my children. I'm the godparent to his child. Well, I'm Jewish, so we don't call it godparent. I'm actually the social justice uncle. We made that shit up. Feel free to borrow it in your own family. This guy was the president of the student body in high school. I was the vice president. We did theater together. We were debate partners together. We've been friends since we were 5, and I still can't just hug him normal. Now, when I get back to his house in Pasadena and I see his wife, Dana, do you think I hug her that way? When I see Dana, do you think I beat the hell out of her spine? How the hell are you, girl? How are you? No, with her, it's just 1, 2, 3, release. Because toxic masculinity teaches us as men that we cannot show compassion and tenderness with other men under heteronormativity. That also means that I cannot express the most basic emotion that I feel for this man whom I love more than any other person, not in my own family, on the face of this earth. That is not healthy for me. It is not just that patriarchy and toxic masculinity are unhealthy for women. That goes without saying, but heteronormative toxic masculinity is incredibly destructive even to those who internalize its norms, because it keeps us from expressing our actual selves and forces us to wear a mask. None of this is good. You see, this is the pathology of privilege, and if we want to get free, we all have to get free. It's as James Baldwin said, and he said it better than I, and I'll end with his words. He said this: any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has already and always known it, the loss of all that gave one identity, the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will bring forth, one clings to what one knew, to what one possessed or dreamed that one possessed. Yet it is only when one is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream one has long cherished or a privilege one has long possessed, that one is set free, that one has set one's self free for higher dreams and for greater privileges. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you.